We live in a culture that is obsessed with the platform and influence. You have influencers, and now, sometimes pastors and ministers have kind of put themselves like they're an influencer.
Right.
And that's very different.
Right.
So I think we make it too difficult.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you passionate about? I've heard it said that. What drives you crazy?
Right.
That's probably what you're called to do. But what is on the other side of your yes?
Right.
It might be one person's life was changed, and then that person goes on to change hundreds of lives. Like, it doesn't matter. We have to be, as Christians, like, willing to say yes. God uses everything for his glory, and it doesn't work like that.
Right.
Like, God's not going to be like, oh, you chose that path,
Yep.
Oh, well.
Yep.
No, God literally redeems the time.
All right, ladies, welcome back to Asking for a Friend, where I get to ask Pastor Donna Lasit questions that she has not seen before. So,
A little scary.
here we go. I'm Kale'i. This is Pastor Donna, and let's dive in. You ready?
I am ready.
Okay, today we want to talk about calling. I think calling can be such a nebulous, grandiose, overwhelming, scary, terrifying word for so many people these days, right? So, on a basic level, what would you say calling is? Help take the pressure off for some ladies.
I think it's just at a basic level. It's like what God created you to do, or who God created you as.
Yeah.
And so often, like, the calling gets put into like the vocation, and it's not always hand in hand like that.
Right. Right.
I remember feeling like called to the ministry. And in the paradigm I grew up in, if you were in ministry, you were in full-time ministry. That's what, if you went to an altar call, it was like, they would do altar calls. I remember a teenager, and they'd be like, if you feel called to the ministry, and half the room would come down. Well, there's only so many vocational ministry jobs, but that's what we were actually thinking, that they were the same. Whereas if I would say, what is my calling? I am called to pastor people, whether I am Pastor Donna Lasit or whether I am 14-year-old teenager, and I just like love people.
Right.
It's like God created me as one who just sees into the spiritual heart sometimes, and I can without even realizing it, I did that. So I think the calling is not just like what you do for work.
Yeah.
It's who you are.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's not just like so weird.
So what you're saying is, at half of those altar calls, half the people that came down for vocational ministry probably shouldn't have come down.
I mean, not all of them could be on staff at a church.
Right, that's real.
But you felt pressure.
Right.
And honestly, it was almost like the first-class citizens were called to ministry.
Right.
And everybody else just did normal jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that is not what the Bible represents. Right. It's like, we all are in the ministry.
Right.
If you are a Christian and Jesus is your Lord,
right,
we are in the ministry, all of us. I
right.
think about different people on our team, like, Amber's husband, LJ. Is he not in the ministry because he's an electrician?
Right.
And yet, man, he is pastoring guys. He is doing small group. He's doing worship. Like, he is totally in the ministry.
Yeah.
So I think that calling can get really sticky. I remember somebody coming to me and being like, I am called to be a worship leader. I'm like, okay.
You're like, girl, you can't sing.
Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, and she could, but also, like, I don't know that the like epitome of your calling when you're a worshiper.
Right.
And it's like, I don't even know if that is a word. Is that a word?
A worshiper?
I don't know if that's a word, but if it's not,
it is today.
The top of the food chain or whatever.
Right.
And it's like epitome. I don't even know what I'm looking for, but it's that person on the top.
Right.
Whereas, like, to me, it's like she was called to be a worshiper.
Right.
And why does that mean, like, you're striving and working your way? I am called to be a worship leader.
Right.
I view myself like I am trying to work myself out of a job because I want the next generation to take the platform in that sense. So it gets passed on, right?
Right.
Am I not worship leading in the front row? I actually believe I am.
Right.
Because I am worshiping and people are following me.
Right.
I mean, it's funny, like, I can walk into a service and just get into worship and I can feel the atmosphere around my little area. Oh, we're worshiping, like, let's go, And so I think calling is who did God made you to be, and you can do that no matter what you're doing for your job.
That reminds me, we did a staff training with my dad, your husband, Pastor Doug dad, and he was talking about calling, and this just came to my mind, but he was like, your calling is to follow Jesus. Like biblically, like we Christians have turned calling into this weird thing, and ministry becomes first class and everything else is second class, and that's not what Jesus intended. Biblically, calling was follow me. Jesus said follow me. That's what calling is.
Good.
Why do you think the church has gotten so twisted up with what calling is?
I mean, I think if you go way back generations, like in terms of ministry, before even the Bible was this goes centuries back. Where people didn't read. And, before the Bible was translated. And it was like, in the Catholic Church, the priests were the only ones that could read the scriptures. And I think it put them like in an elevated kind of position where nobody else had access. And then we forget that in the New Testament, Jesus died. In the Old Testament, they had to everybody had to go through the priest. So it kind of put a lot of pressure on that priest. But when you go to the New Testament, it's like Jesus died and the veil was torn. Like the veil was literally ripped in half. Why? So that we all have direct access to God. And we all follow Jesus personally. We've been talking in staff about like, follow me as I follow Christ. I think like that's totally beautiful, but you're going towards Christ, not just a person. So I think, honestly, we live in a culture that is obsessed with the platform and influence. You have influencers, and now, sometimes pastors and ministers have kind of put themselves like they're an influencer, and that's very different, very different, though we influence people. But I pray that we get back to the basics. That calling is really, like you said, following Christ. But I will be called to worship regardless if I'm the worship pastor, if I have now passed it on to the next generation, and I'm holding a grandchild. I'm going to bring this up every episode if possible.
Every dang episode.
It doesn't have to be your children, but someday, whatever. I am going to be leading worship, even if it's for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. That is something I'm called to.
Our calling is to imitate Jesus so people can imitate us.
Exactly.
That's so good.
So it's like not about like what you do for work. And we can't get hung up on that. Like I am not living up to my calling because I don't have this title. Calling is not a title. Calling is who you are. Doesn't matter your title.
That was church history and culture class 101 with Pastor Donna Lasit. That's so good. So how do you know? I think so many people really wrestle with like what their calling is. How do you know, because what you were saying, calling is and isn't like what God created you to do. Like at the end of the day, calling is following Jesus so people can follow you, right? But we do have different giftings in each of our hands. How do you reconcile that, what you were created to do, with what your giftings are, and also just Jesus?
Think about this. Are you called to youth ministry?
Absolutely, I am.
How do you know that?
Because I'm good with young people.
So there's things we just naturally fall into. I remember before we were youth pastors, I had my car filled with teenagers all the time. It had actually never crossed my mind that I would maybe be leading myself into youth ministry someday. I just literally loved teenagers still to this day. The last 2 weekends, my house has been filled with them, even when I wasn't there. I want to provide even the atmosphere for teenagers to find God. So I think we make it so difficult, and you kind of have to just stop and think like, what is very natural to me? And some people are very natural to hospitality in a way that just makes the whole room feel comfortable. So don't just like overlook that, Maybe you're the one that's just naturally seeing the person that's by themselves. Maybe like one of your ministries is that you're going to be somebody that finds the lonely person, and that's part of like who you were called and created to be. So I think we make it too difficult. It's like, what are you passionate about? I've heard it said that what drives you crazy, that's probably what you're called to do. Like it drove me crazy to not see youth that were passionate love with Jesus. Because I felt like I was so impacted as a teenager. So then it's like, man, I just started naturally being like, well, I'll pick them up.
Right.
Because that drives me crazy that they weren't there on Wednesday night.
Right.
Why weren't they there on Wednesday night?
Yep.
Oh, well, I will fix that. You know?
Right.
So I think it's like, what are you passionate about?
Right.
You know, maybe you see people that are really financially struggling and you're like, God is stirring your heart. And you don't have to wait for a church initiative to walk into your calling.
Ooh. Ooh.
Do you know what I'm saying?
You don't have to wait for church initiative to walk.
You walk into your calling. If you feel called to the lost, and then start evangelizing.
Yep.
And really start going there with your
Right.
neighbors and your
Right.
coworkers. I mean, I feel we're all called to that.
Yep.
But just start doing
Right.
what God has put in your heart as a passion.
Why do you think it's so hard for people sometimes to get over that barrier, though? Because they wait for church giving initiatives.
Yeah.
They wait for somebody to ask them. They
Yeah.
wait for, and they wait for, and they wait for, and then you're 35, and then you're 45,
Right.
and then you're 55, and you're like, I never, I still don't know what my calling is.
I think the enemy always puts insecurity in us, right?
Yeah.
Like, you doubt yourself, like, why would anybody want to listen to me?
Right.
You know, it's like, why
Right.
would I do that? And
Yeah.
we all kind of like tend to diminish ourselves. One thing I think I've been noticing even more, that one of the enemy's schemes is to always diminish it, like the diminisher. Like he comes and he diminishes that what was really dropped into our hearts by God to go to do something, and then you're like, that's really not going to make a difference. Like, I remember the other day, God was like, just walk over to that person and encourage them. And I'm walking over and I'm like, I don't know what I'm even encouraging to them, and then I just encourage them. That's part of how God created me to be.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't matter if the whole world changed in that moment. I was obedient. I think honestly, part of why we hold back is because, we're not letting God grow us. If we're truly letting God grow us, we're going to more and more obey the nudges of the Holy Spirit and not listen to the lies of the enemy that says, like, you're not making a difference.
Yeah.
And God, like, nudged your heart to do that. So who knows?
Yeah.
I asked myself this question, and I've preached a whole message about this. But what is on the other side of your yes?
Right.
It might be one person's life was changed, and then that person goes on to change hundreds of lives. Like, it doesn't matter. We have to be, as Christians, like, willing to say yes to the little nudges of the Holy Spirit, to encourage someone, to pray for someone, to talk to someone in a grocery store, to, just go somewhere, buy somebody dinner, whatever it is. Who knows what God's tapping on your heart?
What would you say to the woman who says, I've missed it?
You know what? This makes me cry. Because people are walking out there that feel like it's too late.
Right.
I did a little devotional. It's like you're behind in life and you've missed it. I'm like, it is never too late.
Yep.
It is never too late to start literally obeying God and saying, Lord, little I have. You know what is so beautiful? I love the story in the Bible when the widow just had a mite, which, when you go back, it was something like 2 cents that she put in the offering.
Right.
2 cents. But she said yes. God commended her for her 2 cents.
Yeah.
More than he commended people that gave huge offerings.
Yeah.
And I think it's like, we have to remember, you might be like, it's too late, it's too little. It's never too late. And also, what does it say in the Word of God? He uses all things for his glory.
Yeah.
And he can restore, these are all verses. He can restore what the locust has eaten.
Yep.
The enemy stole some years. God can multiply the years.
Yep.
I remember, Doug was 27, and I remember one time he said, when we got married and we started ministry, youth pastoring, and I remember someone saying, 27, that's kind of late.
Somebody said that?
Yeah. And it kind of just threw me, and then I was like, wow, he got saved, but look what God fast forwarded.
Yeah.
He didn't get saved till he's 21.
Right.
He didn't graduate from college till right before we got married, or right after we got married, she got his diploma.
Right.
But it's like, God's timeline is so different than our timeline. And he can use all of the timelines.
I mean, that's like the Lazarus principle,
Yeah.
right? Where the disciples and everybody are freaking out. They're like, Jesus, why are you not rushing to come
Right.
save Lazarus?
Right.
And he's like, are there not 24 hours in a day? And you read that and you're kind of like, what the heck does that even mean?
Right.
And then when Jesus arrives on the scene, it's never too late.
Never. Like,
That's so powerful.
God can bring, like he did with Lazarus.
Right.
He can bring him back from the grave.
Right.
And also, this last week I was ministering in a church, and someone actually came up to me and said that one of their friends is about my age, and they're very, very much living in regret because they felt like they were called to the ministry and instead they chose business. And now it's like pretty much paralyzed them in life. And I was so grieved by that because number one, God uses everything for his glory, and it doesn't work like that.
Right.
Like God's not going to be like, oh, you chose that path,
Yep.
oh well.
Yep.
No, God literally redeems the time.
Yep.
He can redeem every mistake, every
Right.
misturn. And I love what you talk about in youth, where there's
Yeah.
like the purpose,
I call it
pressure,
purpose-driven
and
anxiety.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's like we can have that as adults.
Right.
Where we're like, oh
Yep.
my word, I did the wrong thing. I missed it.
Right.
It's harder to miss the will of God than
Right.
we
I
realize.
remember like my senior year of high school, I was falling apart. I was trying to decide where I was going to go to college and where I was going to apply and all of this. And I remember I like broke down to you one day, and you looked at me and you were like, Kale'i, God is so much bigger than where you decide to go to college.
Yep.
As long as your heart is after Jesus,
Yep.
even if you did make the wrong decision, God can redeem that and you're not ruining your whole life. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're right.
He does.
Because he's so much bigger than those
Yep.
decisions. He can
does.
redeem anything.
And he uses them even.
Right.
How crazy
Yeah.
is that? Like
Yeah.
even some wrong decisions or wrong turns we make or whatever,
Yeah.
God even can use them for his glory. There might be somebody you cross paths with
Right.
because of that so-called mistake.
Right.
Like God can use it all.
Yep.
He's so much bigger.
Yep. Oh my
than
gosh.
what we think.
Also, there's that thing
Yeah.
that you've said this to us our whole lives. I don't know if it's an original Pastor Donna Lasit or if you've heard it from somebody else, but
Yeah.
I think with the purpose-driven anxiety, I call it PDA. In the youth group, we've rewritten what PDA is, and it's purpose-driven anxiety. But one of the things that you've said to me over the years so many times is when you're feeling purpose-driven anxiety and you're becoming paralyzed by it to the point where you can't make decisions because you're too scared that if I go right, it's wrong. If I go left, it's wrong. If I go backward, it's wrong. So you just sit. And you always would look at me and you'd say, sitting is the worst thing because
Yeah.
God can't steer a car that's
Yeah,
parked.
that was my pastor.
And I was like,
That was not an original Donna Lasit. That was actually growing up with Brother Dick Iverson.
right,
And I remember him saying,
Yeah.
you can't steer a parked car.
right. It's
And
like,
I
just
was
go,
like, just move, and God
love Jesus
can-
and go.
He will direct you.
Right,
He will
Yeah.
direct you and order your steps.
right.
Yeah.
Would you say there's a difference between purpose and calling?
That is an interesting question.
Is it just semantics and
I
it's
think it's a
kind of
little bit
like
semantics. I'm
Yeah.
sure some theologian could pick it apart, but to me, calling is part of like what I was meant to do. And so I do think calling can be more specific in that sense, where God might be calling you for a season to go to the mission field. So you hear his voice calling you to go to the mission field. So I think
following
maybe
Jesus.
it's following Jesus,
Yeah.
and he might bring you different seasons to do
Right.
different things. Whereas purpose, I think, is always there. Like always my
Yeah.
purpose. And a Christian's purpose
Right.
is very similar.
Yeah.
All of our purpose is
Right.
to bring, gospel attention.
Right. What would you say to a woman who wrestles because they feel like they've heard from God a calling or a purpose, but they don't feel that they have the resources to do that? Whether that's finance, personality, giftings, skills, like what would be what do you do when you find yourself there?
There's waiting seasons.
Yeah.
There is waiting seasons. And I think that God uses each season for something different.
Yeah.
So if this is not a season where the resources are there, maybe you don't have the finances, like for instance, I was talking with someone and they felt like they really want to minister to women. And they have like kind of like all these Bible studies in their heads or whatever. I said, that's awesome. What are you doing with it right now? So if God has given you a desire or kind of this nudge to do that, then it has to actually come into your life. So I said, what are you doing practically? You know, you need to set some time aside to write. You need to set some time. And sometimes there's so much you can do for free that you don't have the resources. But I would say this, I remember when you guys were little, there are certain things I had to put on the shelf for a season where it's like, you know, my life was a little insane. So maybe you're in a season where it's like, I can't do all the things, all the dreams in my heart. Don't be discouraged.
Right.
Instead, I view those seasons as getting tools.
Yeah.
I'm just collecting tools.
Yep.
When I get to that point, I'm going to have another tool in my bag because I went through this.
Right.
And so be like mindful and never get discouraged in the waiting or in the like, it's not now, I don't have maybe the time or the resources or whatever. But know that like, that doesn't mean you're not doing anything. God is developing you. God is developing your patience. Maybe you're supposed to pray about it. Maybe maybe you're hearing a little bit wrong, or sometimes like I'll hear something and assume it means this. And God's like, actually, I meant this, but just start moving again.
Right.
And God can like redirect you. So I think it's don't be discouraged in the waiting. Don't be discouraged, but don't do nothing.
Right.
Because you know what you can always do? You know, you find time for what you want to find time for.
Yeah.
You find time to brush your teeth. You find time to have a shower. When you are diligent in spending time with Jesus, you're gonna land where you're supposed to land.
Yeah.
God is gonna give you direction. And maybe that's your season right now is you are growing inside.
Yeah.
You know what they say? It's like underneath the tallest buildings have the deepest foundations. So sometimes we're in a foundation season and we want to be on top. We want to be seen. We want this dream in our hearts, whatever. And God's like, I'm just digging the foundation. And let God do that. Don't be frustrated by that.
I think it's so hard. I'm not a patience girl.
You're not?
No.
I didn't know that.
So how do you do that? Like, honestly. Some of us hate being patient.
I think it is something first of all, it's a fruit of the Spirit. So I know I said that about a love, but honestly, everything in my life comes back to really the more time we spend filling our lives with the Spirit of God, the fruit will come out.
Right.
But I think perspectives helps patience. So how you see something affects your emotions greatly. So if I am looking at my life and being like, nothing's happening, like I'm so frustrated, God gave me this dream, this desire, nothing's happening. That's a perspective issue, not a patience issue. And so I think when you're feeling impatient, change your perspective and ask the Lord to change how you see what you're going through. Because like when we started a church, I was impatient. I remember literally acting like a 2-year-old. I laid myself out. I was like so impatient. Wasn't growing. We weren't finding a location, like all of those things. And I laid myself down and I literally like a 2-year-old, I got you guys watching a movie. I went up to my bedroom and I was pounding on the floor, laying on the ground. Throwing a temper tantrum.
Donna.
Literally. And it was like, I was seeing things wrong. I was like, this didn't happen like how I wanted it to happen. Like I wanted it to grow fast. You know, we'd been part of ministries that had grown and been large and like, you know, almost like, you know, pride. It was like, I'm too big for this season.
Do you not know who I am, God?
It's like, I'm too big for this season. And honestly, in retrospect, I'm embarrassed for one. But what God did in those first few years, I literally wouldn't trade for anything in the whole wide world. Because what God was doing was so internal, that was equipping me, shaping me, humbling me, literally for where I am right now. How are we going to minister to pastors if we've never gone through anything? We got to go through all these things. I had to be patient. And then I was laughing. I was sitting with a pastor and their church had kind of like grown quickly. And I said, man, and honestly, like my heart, it stung my heart because I was like, why are we having to just like grow slow? Like,
Right.
And honestly, she looked at me and she was like, tears in her eyes. She's like, I wish we would have grown slow.
Oof.
And I looked at her and I was like, what in the world is this conversation?
Right.
And I was like, whoa. She said the problems, the messes, the internal things that we went through because we grew too fast were really hard. And I left that conversation. I was like, man, I wish in those waiting seasons I could have changed my perspective and realized, something is growing. I just can't see it.
Right.
I mean, what's that song like? Even when I can't see it, you're working.
Yep.
It's so very true.
Yep.
When we're like, man, I see this out here.
Yep.
You have to have eyes of faith. It's all about your perspective.
Right. Which it's so humbling. I said this to a young person the other day that I was pastoring where I was like, dude, God just straight up has more information than you do. I was like, I know this is so simple, but like, you sound really prideful right now.
Right. He sees ahead.
You really think you know better than God does. Do you think? And they were like, I've never thought about it that way. And I was like, but I'm saying that to the young person as I think of 6 other things. And I'm like, yeah, I'm doing the same thing. But that's what we do. We think we know better. We think we know what's the easier battle or the easier timing or the easier relationships. And it's like, God knows more than you do.
He has the whole timeline. And not even just our timeline.
Right.
He has all of eternity in a line. And he's looking up from here. And that's why he's like, we're impatient.
Right.
He's like, this is all perfectly in my time.
Right.
And I think it really comes back to trust.
Right.
Trusting God, seeing through his lens, his perspective.
That's so good. Okay, any ending last thoughts on calling, purpose, trust?
I think
all of it.
One last thought is enjoy the now. Enjoy the now. You'll never get it back.
Yeah.
There's things that you'll dream of when your kids are in school that you'll be like, I wish I could go back to enjoy every season, or you'll get to the end of your life and you were always waiting for the next season. You're always waiting for this. Like when this happens, when this happens, when I finally arrive. If we don't stop and enjoy the now, we're going to miss our whole journey. And that would make me very, very sad. So enjoy the now.
That's so good. Thanks, Pastor Donna.
Of course.